In a world where kindness often goes unnoticed and compassion is mistaken for weakness, there are moments that define not just who we are, but who we choose to become. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a single mother whose simple act of human decency would change her life forever. But more than that, it's a story about the hidden tests we face every day, the choices we make when we think nobody is watching, and the profound truth that sometimes the person you help might just be the one person who can help you back. What you're about to hear isn't just another feel-good story. It's a reminder that in our increasingly disconnected world, the smallest gestures can have the most extraordinary consequences. So settle in, because Sarah's journey from desperation to redemption will challenge everything you think you know about fairness, justice, and the power of treating every person with dignity. Hey there, dear friends, welcome back. Before we dive in, let me ask you this. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to know. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this that prove kindness never goes unnoticed. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that hard work would eventually pay off. At 32, she had been telling herself this lie for so long that she almost believed it. Almost. But as she stood in the cramped bathroom of Murphy's Diner at 11:47 p.m., staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror, the weight of reality pressed down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her uniform, once crisp and white, now bore the stains of a 12-hour shift. Coffee rings, ketchup smears, and the general grime that comes from serving hundreds of customers who barely acknowledged her existence. Her feet ached in shoes that should have been replaced months ago, but replacing shoes meant choosing between footwear and her son's school supplies. The choice was always easy, even when it meant enduring the pain. Sarah pulled her phone from her apron pocket, the screen lighting up to reveal a cascade of notifications she didn't want to see. 3 missed calls from her landlord, 2 text messages from the electric company, 1 email with the subject line, "Final Notice," that made her stomach clench. She quickly turned the phone face down, as if hiding the screen could make the problems disappear. "Sarah, Table 12 needs their check." The voice of her manager, Robert Peterson, cut through the thin bathroom door like a knife. Even through the barrier, she could hear the irritation in his tone. Peterson had been managing Murphy's Diner for 8 years, and in that time, he had perfected the art of making his employees feel inconveniences rather than assets. "Coming," Sarah called back, splashing cold water on her face and taking a deep breath. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of Peterson was like showing blood to a shark. He fed on the desperation of his workers, using their need for employment as leverage to extract every ounce of effort while giving as little as possible in return. She pushed through the bathroom door and back into the fluorescent-lit world of Murphy's Diner. The place had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1980s when the red vinyl booths were new and the checkered floor tiles weren't chipped and stained. Now it existed in that liminal space between nostalgic charm and outright decay, the kind of place that survived on habit rather than quality. Table 12 was occupied by a young couple who couldn't have been older than 25. They sat close together, sharing a piece of apple pie and whispering the kind of sweet nothings that made Sarah's heart ache with loneliness. She remembered being that young, that hopeful, that certain that love could conquer anything. Before life taught her that love, while powerful, couldn't pay rent or put food on the table. "Here's your check," Sarah said, placing the small slip of paper on the table with a smile that had become as automatic as breathing. "Thank you for coming in tonight." The young man looked up at her, really looked, and for a moment Sarah felt seen. "Thank you," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. The service was excellent. Such a simple compliment, but it hit Sarah like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. In a job where she was often treated as invisible, being acknowledged as a human being rather than just a service provider meant everything. As she walked back toward the kitchen, Sarah's mind drifted to her son, Tyler. 8 years old and already showing signs of the intelligence that Sarah prayed would be his ticket to a better life than hers. He was staying with Mrs. Rodriguez tonight, their elderly neighbor who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Tyler. Mrs. Rodriguez never asked for payment, but Sarah always tried to slip her a few dollars when she could, knowing that the woman's Social Security barely covered her own expenses. Tyler had been asking questions lately. Why did Mommy work so late? Why couldn't they go to the movies like his friends? Why did they eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so often? Sarah had become an expert at deflecting these questions with humor and distraction, but she knew that Tyler was getting older, more perceptive. Soon, he would understand the reality of their situation, and that knowledge would steal something from his childhood that Sarah desperately wanted to preserve. The diner was winding down for the night. The dinner rush, such as it was. The bell above Murphy's diner door chimed with a sound that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own heartbeat. She looked up from wiping down the counter, expecting to see one of the regulars who often stopped by for late-night coffee and conversation. Instead, she saw a man she didn't recognize, and something about him immediately caught her attention. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. His clothes told a story of hard times. A jacket that had once been brown but had faded to an indeterminate color, jeans with holes that weren't fashionable but functional, and shoes that had walked many miles on unforgiving pavement. But it was his eyes that struck Sarah most. Despite his disheveled appearance, his eyes held an intelligence and depth that seemed at odds with his circumstances. The man hesitated in the doorway, as if debating whether to enter or retreat. Sarah had seen this hesitation before, usually in people who were counting coins in their pocket and wondering if they had enough for even the cheapest item on the menu. Her heart went out to him immediately. "Good evening," Sarah called out, her voice warm and welcoming. "Come on in. Sit wherever you'd like." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly at her tone. He shuffled to a booth in the corner, the kind of spot that people choose when they want to be left alone with their thoughts. Sarah gave him a moment to settle before approaching with a menu and a glass of water. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" she asked, setting the water down gently. The man looked up at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, at being treated with basic human kindness. "Coffee, please," he said, his voice rough as if he hadn't used it much lately. "Just coffee." Sarah nodded and returned with a steaming mug, the ceramic warm against her hands. She set it down and noticed how the man's fingers wrapped around it as if drawing comfort from the heat. "Take your time looking at the menu," she said. "No rush." But even as she said it, Sarah could see that the man wasn't really looking at the menu. His eyes were focused on the coffee, and she noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. It wasn't the tremor of age or illness, but something else. Hunger, maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. From across the diner, Sarah watched him nurse his coffee, making each sip last as long as possible. She had seen this behavior before, in people who knew that one cup of coffee might be all they could afford, so they made it stretch as far as it would go. Her heart ached for him, recognizing in his careful movements the same desperation she felt when counting her own meager tips at the end of each shift. The diner was nearly empty now. The young couple had left, pressing a $5 tip into Sarah's hand with shy smiles. An elderly man who came in every Tuesday for meatloaf and mashed potatoes was finishing his meal in companionable silence. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen, and the soft jazz music that played from speakers that had seen better decades. Sarah found herself stealing glances at the stranger, trying to piece together his story. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the image of someone down on their luck. The way he held himself, even in his obvious discomfort, suggested a man who had once known better times. His hands, though weathered, didn't have the calluses of someone who had spent years in manual labor. And when he thought no one was looking, she caught glimpses of an alertness in his expression that spoke of a sharp mind still working behind tired eyes. 20 minutes passed, and the man was still nursing his coffee. Sarah could see that the mug was nearly empty, and she knew that soon he would have to make a decision: order something else or leave. She had a feeling she knew which choice he would make, and it broke her heart. She was wiping down tables when she heard Peterson's voice from the kitchen, loud enough to carry across the diner. "Sarah, stop hovering around that bum and get back to work. We don't run a charity here." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, not for herself but for the stranger who couldn't have helped but hear Peterson's cruel words. She glanced over and saw the man's shoulders tense, his head dropping lower, as if trying to make himself invisible. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the pie case, where a few slices of apple pie sat under the warming lights. The pie was good, Mrs. Henderson, the day cook, made it from scratch every morning, but it was also expensive by Murphy's Diner standards. $7.50 for a slice that most of their customers considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Sarah cut a generous piece, added a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and placed it on one of the diner's better plates. Then she walked over to the stranger's table, her heart pounding with the knowledge that what she was about to do could cost her job. "On the house," she said quietly, setting the plate down in front of him. "Everyone deserves something sweet." The man looked up at her with an expression of such surprise and gratitude that Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I can't pay for this." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice equally soft. "That's why it's on the house." "But your manager, don't worry about him," Sarah said, though her stomach was already churning with anxiety about Peterson's reaction. "Just enjoy it." The man stared at the pie as if it were made of gold. When he finally took a bite, Sarah saw his eyes close in what looked like pure bliss. It occurred to her that this might be the first real meal he'd had in days, and the thought made her chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah think he was thanking her for more than just the pie. "You have no idea what this means." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt all day. We all need a little kindness sometimes. She was about to walk away when Peterson's voice boomed across the diner. "Sarah Mitchell." The sound of her full name spoken in Peterson's angry tone made Sarah's blood run cold. She had worked at Murphy's Diner for 3 years, and in all that time, she had never heard Peterson use her full name unless she was in serious trouble. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, to see her manager striding across the diner floor with the purposeful gait of a man on a mission. Robert Peterson was not a large man physically, but he had perfected the art of making himself seem imposing through sheer force of personality. At 58, he had the soft build of someone who spent his days behind a desk or standing behind a counter, but his eyes held the hardness of someone who had learned to see employees as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than human beings with families and dreams. "My office, now." The words were clipped, precise, and left no room for argument. Sarah glanced back at the stranger, who was watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. She wanted to tell him not to worry, that everything would be fine, but the words stuck in her throat. Because deep down, she knew that everything was not going to be fine. Peterson's office was a cramped space behind the kitchen, barely large enough for a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that had seen better decades. The walls were covered with schedules, health department certificates, and motivational posters that seemed to mock the reality of working at Murphy's Diner. "Teamwork makes the dream work," proclaimed one poster, featuring a photograph of people in business suits high-fiving over a conference table. Sarah had always found it ironic that Peterson had chosen to decorate his office with images of success and collaboration when he seemed to actively work against both. Peterson closed the door behind them with more force than necessary, the sound echoing in the small space like a gunshot. He didn't sit down, instead choosing to loom over Sarah as she took the chair across from his desk. "Do you want to explain to me what just happened out there?" Peterson's voice was deceptively calm, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I gave a customer a piece of pie." "You gave away a piece of pie," Peterson corrected, emphasizing each word as if Sarah were a child who needed concepts explained in simple terms. $7.50 worth of pie, plus ice cream, plus the cost of the plate and utensils. Do you know what that represents, Sarah? It represents kindness, Sarah said, the words coming out stronger than she had expected. It represents treating people with dignity. Peterson's laugh was harsh and humorless. It represents theft. You stole from this establishment. You took money directly out of the register and handed it to some vagrant who wandered in off the street. He's not a vagrant, Sarah protested, though she realized she had no evidence to support this claim. He's a customer who needed help. He's a bum, Peterson said bluntly. And you're a waitress, not a social worker. Your job is to take orders, serve food, and collect payment. It is not your job to decide who deserves charity and who doesn't. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. So I'm supposed to watch someone go hungry when I have the power to help? You're supposed to do your job, Peterson snapped. This isn't the first time, Sarah. I've seen you slip extra bread to customers, give larger portions than what they ordered, forget to charge for refills. You think I don't notice, but I notice everything. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had indeed done those things, small acts of kindness that she had hoped would go unnoticed. An extra dinner roll for an elderly man who always ate alone. A larger scoop of ice cream for a child whose parents were clearly struggling. An extra cup of coffee for a truck driver who had been driving all night. She had never thought of these actions as theft, but as basic human compassion. Those people needed help, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. And that's not your decision to make, Peterson replied. This is a business, not a soup kitchen. Every piece of food you give away comes out of our profit margin. Every act of kindness you perform costs this establishment money. Sarah looked up at Peterson, really looked at him, and saw something that made her stomach turn. There was no compassion in his eyes, no understanding of what it meant to struggle. To him, the people who came into Murphy's Diner were not human beings with stories and struggles and dreams. They were transactions, sources of revenue, nothing more. I paid for the pie, Sarah said suddenly, the lie coming to her lips before she could stop it. I paid for it with my own money. Peterson's eyes narrowed. Is that so? Then you won't mind if I check the register receipts against tonight's inventory. Sarah's heart sank. Of course he would check. Peterson was nothing if not thorough when it came to protecting the diner's profits. She had been caught in a lie, and they both knew it. I was going to pay for it, she said weakly. At the end of my shift. With what money? Peterson asked, and there was something almost cruel in his tone. Sarah, I know exactly how much you make here. I know you're behind on your rent, behind on your bills. I know you can barely afford to feed yourself, let alone pay for food to give away to strangers. The words hit Sarah like slaps across the face. The fact that Peterson knew about her financial struggles and was using them against her felt like a violation of something sacred. Her poverty was not a weapon to be wielded against her, but Peterson seemed to see it as exactly that. So what happens now? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Peterson sat down behind his desk, his movements deliberate and final. Now, you clean out your locker and turn in your apron. You're fired, effective immediately. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah felt the world tilt around her, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become unstable. Fired. After 3 years of loyal service, of working double shifts when other employees called in sick, of staying late to help with inventory, of treating every customer with respect and kindness, fired for the crime of compassion. Please, Sarah said, and she hated the desperation in her own voice. I need this job. I have a son. I can't. Peterson cut her off, his voice cold. Not my problem. Turn in your apron on your way out. She left the office in a daze, the world spinning around her. The other staff looked away as she gathered her things, shame burning in her cheeks. The stranger watched from his booth, his expression stricken, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. She walked out into the morning, the sun now fully risen, her dreams unraveling with every step. That night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed in the tiny apartment above the laundromat, mother and son against the world, and for a moment, the heaviness in Sarah's chest eased. Tyler's breathing slowed as he drifted back to sleep, his head on her shoulder. She stroked his hair, letting her own silent tears fall. In the quiet, she promised herself she would not let him down. Tomorrow, she will find a way. She had to. The city outside was restless, sirens wailing in the distance, car horns echoing through the alley. Sarah stared at the ceiling, remembering her own mother's words, "Kindness is never wasted, even when it feels like it is." She wondered if her mother had ever felt so lost, so small against the world's indifference. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She dreamed of the diner of laughter and warmth, of apple pie and second chances. But even in her dreams, the stranger's eyes followed her, full of questions she couldn't answer. Morning came too soon. Sarah woke to the sound of Tyler getting ready for school, humming to himself as if nothing had changed. She forced a smile, packed his lunch, and walked him to the bus stop, holding his hand a little tighter than usual. As the bus pulled away, she waved until it turned the corner, then let herself cry in the cold morning air. She spent the day searching for work, walking from store to store, filling out applications, enduring the polite smiles and empty promises. By late afternoon, her feet ached and her hope felt thin as paper. She returned home, checked the mailbox, and found nothing but bills. That night, as she tucked Tyler in, he looked up at her with sleepy confidence. "You'll find a new job, Mom. You always do." She kissed his forehead, wishing she believed it as much as he did. "Good night, baby. I love you more than anything." "I love you too," he whispered, already drifting away. Sarah sat by the window long after he was asleep, watching the city lights flicker. She thought of the stranger, of the pie, of the small kindness that had cost her everything, and she wondered if, somewhere, it had made a difference. The next morning, Sarah woke with a knot in her stomach. It was payday, and she still needed her last check from Murphy's Diner. She dreaded facing Peterson, dreaded the looks from her former coworkers, but she had no choice. She needed that money for rent, for groceries, for Tyler. She dressed in her cleanest clothes, pulled her hair back, and walked a few blocks to the diner. The air was brisk, the sky heavy with clouds. The neon sign buzzed in the window as she approached, the familiar hum both comforting and painful. Inside, the diner looked like the same regulars hunched over their coffee, the smell of bacon and burnt toast in the air. But as Sarah entered, conversations faltered. Heads turned. She felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious. Peterson stood behind the counter, arms crossed. He handed her the envelope without a word, his expression unreadable. Sarah took it, resisting the urge to say anything. What could she say that would matter? As she turned to leave, she heard a voice from the corner booth. "Sarah?" She froze. The stranger sat there, cleaner now, wearing a pressed shirt and a gentle smile. He looked different, but his eyes were the same kind. Searching. She hesitated, uncertain, but he motioned her over. "Please, sit with me for a moment." Sarah glanced at Peterson, who watched with narrowed eyes, but she sat anyway. The stranger's presence calmed her, though she didn't know why. He reached into his pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. "For your trouble and your kindness." Sarah frowned, pushing it back. "I didn't help you for money." He smiled, sadness in his eyes. "I know, that's why it matters." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something familiar. Loneliness, hope, gratitude. She nodded, slipping the envelope into her purse. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, as if something important had just been settled. Sarah stood, feeling lighter than she had in days. As she left the diner, she glanced back. The stranger watched her go, his gaze full of secrets. A week passed. Sarah spent her days searching for work, her nights worrying over bills. The envelope the stranger had given her sat unopened in her purse, a reminder of a kindness she didn't quite understand. One afternoon, as she walked Tyler home from school, she noticed a crowd gathered outside Murphy's Diner. Curious, she approached Tyler's hand in hers. The diner looked brighter somehow. A sleek black car was parked out front, and a man in a tailored suit stood by the door, talking to Peterson. As Sarah drew closer, she realized with a jolt that the man was the stranger transformed. He caught sight of her and smiled, beckoning her forward. The crowd parted, whispers following her. Peterson's face was pale, his eyes darting between Sarah and the stranger. "Everyone," the man said, his voice carrying, "my name is Oscar Wellington. I am the new owner of Murphy's Diner." A stunned silence fell. Peterson sputtered. Owner? But, Oscar held up a hand. I purchased the property last month. I wanted to see how things were run before making any decisions. He turned to Sarah, his expression warm. This woman showed me kindness when she had nothing to gain. She treated a stranger with dignity and compassion. That's the spirit I want in my business. The crowd murmured, eyes wide. Oscar faced Peterson, his tone cool. You, on the other hand, fired her for an act of generosity. That is not the kind of leadership I want here. He paused, letting the words sink in. Effective immediately, Sarah is rehired as general manager. Peterson, your services are no longer required. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Peterson's face turned red, but he said nothing, storming off as Oscar turned back to Sarah. She stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Tyler squeezed her hand, grinning up at her. Oscar smiled. You earned this, Sarah. Thank you for reminding me what really matters. The days that followed felt like a dream. Sarah stepped into her new role as general manager with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She set about transforming the diner, not just with fresh paint and new menus, but with a spirit of kindness and community. Oscar visited often, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in the same flannel shirt as before. He shared his story with her, how he'd grown up poor, how a stranger's kindness had changed his life, how he'd built his fortune, but never forgotten what it felt like to be hungry and unseen. Together they created a Pay It Forward. The Pay It Forward board filled up so quickly that Sarah had to add a second one. Stories of generosity spread from strangers buying meals for each other, regulars leaving notes of encouragement, even local businesses pitching in to sponsor weekly community dinners. Murphy's Diner became more than a place to eat. It became a safe haven, a place where no one was invisible. Sarah hired back those who'd stood by her, offering second chances to people who needed them most. She started a kindness jar at the register, where anyone could leave $1 or a kind word. The jar overflowed by the end of every week. One night, as Sarah counted the tips, Oscar joined her at the counter. He'd become a fixture, sometimes in his suit, sometimes in his old flannel, always with that same gentle smile. You know, he said, I thought I was coming here to check on a business investment, but you reminded me what real investment looks like. Sarah smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. It was just a slice of pie. He shook his head. It was hope. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. He handed her another envelope, this one containing a letter of partnership. I want you to have a stake in the diner. You made it what it is. Sarah's hands shook as she read the letter. For the first time in years, her future felt secure, not just for her, but for Tyler, too. Thank you, Oscar, for believing in me, Oscar grinned. No, Sarah, thank you for reminding me of the power of kindness. 6 months later, Murphy's Diner was unrecognizable in the best way. The walls were covered with Polaroids of smiling faces, thank you cards, and newspaper clippings about the diner's transformation. The Pay It Forward board had become a mural of hope, with stories scribbled in every corner. Sarah walked through the bustling room, greeting customers by name, her laughter echoing above the clatter of plates. Tyler, now confident and thriving, did his homework at the counter, occasionally pausing to help serve pie or chat with regulars. The diner had become a second home for him, too. Oscar often visited, sometimes bringing other business owners to show them what a community built on compassion could look like. He and Sarah worked together on new projects, job training for single parents, scholarships for local kids, free meals on holidays. One evening, as the sun set and the last customers lingered over coffee, Sarah paused by the window. She looked out at the city, her heart full. Some stories break us, some stories heal us. But the best stories, the ones that truly leave a mark, remind us that a single act of kindness can change the course of a life. Sarah's journey began with a simple gesture, a slice of pie for a stranger in need. It cost her everything, and yet it gave her more than she ever imagined: community, purpose, and hope. In a world that often feels cold and unforgiving, remember this: your smallest kindness might be someone else's miracle. Welcome to Unbroken Truths, where every story leaves a mark, and maybe, just maybe, inspires the next one. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories.